The evening sky turned a deep purple as Alexander Whitfield stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse. His reflection stared back at him, tailored suit, perfectly styled hair, the confident look of a man who had conquered the business world. But his eyes told a different story. Behind them lurked something he'd been hiding for months now: restlessness. Downstairs, the staff bustled about, preparing for what should have been a perfect 5th anniversary celebration. Elena had spent weeks planning it, even though Alexander had shown little interest. He checked his watch. It was almost time. "Alex? Are you up here?" Elena's voice floated through their massive apartment. She appeared in the doorway, wearing a deep blue dress that complemented her olive skin. Her dark hair fell in gentle waves over her shoulders. She was beautiful, anyone would say so, but Alexander felt nothing as he looked at her. "The chef says dinner is almost ready," she said, smiling. "I've had him prepare all your favorites." Alexander nodded. The weight of the day pressed down on him. This wasn't how he'd planned to do this, but he couldn't keep pretending anymore. "Can we talk before dinner?" he asked. Elena's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "Of course. Is everything okay with the company?" "The company's fine," Alexander said, walking past her to pour himself a drink. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the crystal glass to his lips. "It's about us." Elena sat down slowly on their Italian leather sofa, smoothing her dress. There was concern in her eyes now. "I can't do this anymore," Alexander said, the words rushing out before he could soften them. This marriage, it was a mistake. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena's face drained of color. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "Is this some kind of joke?" Alexander shook his head. "I've felt trapped for a long time now. I built an empire where I answer to no one, where I can change the course of my business with a single decision. But here, in this marriage," he gestured around the luxurious apartment that felt more like a prison to him now, "I can't breathe. After 5 years, you can't breathe." Elena's voice cracked. "Where is this coming from? Last month in Paris, you seemed happy." Alexander laughed bitterly. "I'm good at pretending. We both know that." Tears welled in Elena's eyes as she stood up. "So everything has been a lie? All these years?" "Not a lie," Alexander said, looking away from her pain. "But not what I want for the rest of my life either. I need freedom. Adventure. Something different." Elena wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. "And what about what I need? What about what we built together?" Alexander walked back to the window. The city lights twinkled below, promising endless possibilities. "I've already called my lawyers. They'll be fair to you, more than fair." Elena's tears flowed freely now. "I don't want your money, Alex. I want my husband. The man who promised to love me forever just 5 years ago." "That man doesn't exist anymore," Alexander said coldly. "Maybe he never did." He turned to face her, noticing how small she looked standing there in their massive living room. For a brief moment, doubt flickered through him, but he pushed it away. "I'm leaving tonight. My jet is waiting." Elena stepped forward, her hands shaking. "Tonight? You're walking out on our anniversary. Is there ever a good time?" he asked. Elena opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. Her hand drifted to her stomach for just a moment, a gesture Alexander didn't notice as he walked to their bedroom and pulled out the suitcases he'd secretly packed earlier. When he returned, Elena stood exactly where he'd left her, though something had changed in her expression. Behind the hurt was something harder, like determination. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. "Not because I'll make you regret it, but because one day you'll realize what you threw away." Alexander zipped his designer luggage closed. "I doubt that." As he headed for the door, Elena called after him. "There's something you should know." But Alexander raised his hand, cutting her off. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded final. In the empty penthouse, Elena sank to the floor, her tears falling onto the envelope in her hands. Inside were ultrasound images she'd planned to show him over dinner, images that revealed not one baby, but 4. "Your loss," she whispered to the empty room, a new resolve forming through her tears. "Your terrible, terrible loss." 40 years had passed since Alexander walked out of that Manhattan penthouse. The world had been his playground ever since. This morning, he woke up in his Bali villa, the sound of waves crashing against the shore just outside his window. Another perfect day, he muttered to himself, stretching lazily in his king-sized bed. His phone buzzed with messages from his management team. Even from halfway across the world, Alexander ran his tech empire with precision. That was the beauty of the life he'd created, freedom without sacrifice. Or so he told himself. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his schedule. Meetings by video call, decisions to be made, money to be earned. The same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow. Lately, a strange emptiness had begun to follow him from one luxury location to the next, but he pushed the feeling away. This is what success looks like, he reminded himself as he stepped onto his private balcony. But the words rang hollow even to his own ears. Meanwhile, in a cozy colonial-style house in coastal Connecticut, Elena was already 2 hours into her day. The sound of little feet thundered down the hallway as she poured milk into 4 small cereal bowls. "Boys, breakfast," she called, her voice carrying through the modest but comfortable home. 4 identical little faces appeared in the doorway. At 40 years old, the quadruplets were bundles of energy with piercing blue eyes. Alexander's eyes. And dark curls they'd inherited from Elena. "Robbie, that's not your chair," Elena said as she intercepted one twin trying to claim his brother's seat. "Tommy, please don't put your trucks on the table. Andy, we don't throw napkins. Charlie, wonderful job waiting patiently." Mothering 4 identical boys was like orchestrating a tiny, chaotic symphony. Each child had emerged with his own distinct personality despite sharing the same face. Robbie was always the first to charge ahead. Tommy loved anything with wheels. Andy never stopped talking, and Charlie watched everything with thoughtful eyes before making his move. "Mummy, when can we go to the park?" Andy asked between spoonfuls of cereal. "After I finish some work," Elena replied, gulping down her coffee. Since moving back to her hometown, she built a successful interior design business that allowed her to work from home. Her client list had grown steadily, with people appreciating her eye for creating beautiful spaces on realistic budgets. "Can we bring the soccer ball?" Robbie asked. "And my dinosaurs?" Tommy added. Elena smiled, wiping milk from Charlie's chin. "Yes and yes. But first, everyone needs to help clean up their toys from the living room." As the boys raced off to tidy up, turning the simple task into a competition, Elena checked her calendar on the fridge. Between client meetings, preschool pickup, and doctor appointments, her days were packed. But she built this life brick by brick after Alexander left, and pride swelled in her chest when she looked at what she'd accomplished alone. She never told the boys much about their father. When they asked, she simply said he lived far away. As they grew older, she knew the questions would get harder. Sometimes she caught glimpses of Alexander in their mannerisms, the way Robbie tilted his head when confused, or how Charlie's brow furrowed in concentration. It was like living with 4 miniature versions of her ex-husband, minus the selfishness. The sound of breaking glass followed by an "uh-oh" from the living room snapped her back to reality. "It was an accident," came Tommy's panicked voice. "Nobody move, there's glass," Elena called, grabbing the broom. This was her world now, chaotic, exhausting, and sometimes overwhelming. But filled with a love so big it made everything else seem small in comparison. She never regretted not telling Alexander about the boys. In her mind, he'd given up his right to know them the moment he walked out. She had no idea that fate was about to throw them back into each other's paths in the most unexpected way. Alexander drummed his fingers on the leather seat of his town car, checking his watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. The Boston Tech Conference had run longer than expected, and now he was anxious to get back to the airport. "How much longer?" he asked his driver. "There's an accident on the highway, sir. GPS shows at least an hour delay. I can take the coastal route through some small towns if you prefer to keep moving." Alexander nodded impatiently. "Just get me to the airport as quickly as possible." As the sleek black car turned off the highway, Alexander returned to his phone calls, barely noticing the charming New England scenery passing by his window. Quaint buildings, small shops, and tree-lined streets held no interest for him. "We need to stop for gas, sir," the driver announced after they'd been driving for about 20 minutes. "There's a small town coming up in a few miles." Alexander sighed. "Fine. I could use some coffee anyway. The car pulled into a picture-perfect coastal town, the kind that appeared on postcards. The driver found a gas station while Alexander spotted a coffee shop across the street. "I'll be right back," he told the driver, straightening his designer suit as he walked toward the Lighthouse Cafe. The bell above the door jingled as Alexander pushed it open. The cafe was warm and inviting, with mismatched furniture and local artwork on the walls. A few elderly couples sat chatting over pastries, and a woman worked on her laptop in the corner. Nothing remarkable. Alexander approached the counter to order when something caught his eye. At a round table in the back corner sat a woman with her back to him. Something about the curve of her neck and the way she tilted her head seemed oddly familiar. But it wasn't her that made Alexander freeze in place, it was the 4 identical little boys sitting with her. 4 pairs of bright blue eyes, his eyes looked up from their coloring books. 4 little faces that were carbon copies of his childhood photos. 4 miniature versions of himself, right down to the cowlick in their dark hair. The coffee cup slipped from Alexander's hand and shattered on the floor. The noise cut through the quiet cafe like a gunshot. "Oh goodness," the barista exclaimed, rushing around with a towel. But Alexander couldn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, staring at the children who couldn't possibly be who he thought they were, and yet, somehow, he knew with absolute certainty. The woman at the table turned at the commotion, and Alexander felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Elena," he whispered, though she was too far away to hear. Their eyes locked across the room. Elena's face drained of color. For a suspended moment, neither of them moved. The busy cafe seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them caught in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. "Mommy, why did that man drop his cup?" one of the boys asked loudly, breaking the silence. Elena snapped back to life. "Boys, pack up your crayons. We need to go." She moved with the efficiency of someone used to herding multiple children, gathering coloring books and small backpacks while keeping her eyes fixed on Alexander. The boys, curious as all 4-year-olds are, stared openly at the stranger. "He looks like us," another one whispered loudly. Alexander took a step forward, then another. His legs felt wooden, his heart hammering so hard he was sure everyone in the cafe could hear it. "Elena," he said again, this time loud enough for her to hear. "Please wait." She froze, her hand tightening around the smallest boy's backpack. The look she gave Alexander could have frozen fire. Anger, shock, and something like panic flashed across her face. "Boys, stay close to me," she said, trying to guide them toward the door. But Alexander was blocking their path now, his mind racing to process what was happening. These children, there were 4 of them, identical in every way, with a perfect blend of his features and Elena's coloring, and they appeared to be about 4 years old. 4 years. The math wasn't difficult. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though he already knew the answer. Elena lifted her chin, protective and defiant all at once. "Meet your sons," she said coldly. "The ones you never bothered to know about." The small-town park was empty except for a few birds hopping around the playground. Elena sat rigidly on a bench, her eyes never leaving the boys as they climbed over the jungle gym. Alexander stood awkwardly nearby, his expensive suit out of place among the wood chips and metal slides. "How old are they?" he finally asked, though he already knew the answer. 4 years and 2 months, Elena replied coldly. Alexander did the mental math. "You were pregnant when I left." "Congratulations on your excellent arithmetic skills," Elena said, her voice sharp with years of bottled anger. "I was going to tell you that night. Our anniversary dinner." Alexander's mind flashed back to that evening, to Elena trying to tell him something as he walked out the door. The weight of his mistake crashed down on him like a physical blow. "Why didn't you tell me afterward?" he asked, watching as one of the boys helped another climb a ladder. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Tell you? You made it perfectly clear our marriage was a mistake. You walked out without looking back. Your lawyers delivered divorce papers to my hospital room 3 days after they were born." Alexander winced. He'd been in Thailand by then, instructing his legal team to handle everything. He hadn't known, or cared, where the papers would find her. "I had a right to know," he said, hearing the weakness in his own argument. "You forfeited that right when you abandoned me," Elena fired back. These boys deserved a father who wanted them, not one who had to be dragged back by obligation. On the playground, the boys were now taking turns going down the slide, their identical faces lit up with joy. Alexander couldn't take his eyes off them. "What are their names?" he asked quietly. Elena's expression softened slightly as she looked at her sons. "Robbie is on the swing. He's always been the daredevil. Tommy is the one collecting rocks. Andy is the chatterbox telling everyone what to do. And Charlie is the one making sure everyone takes turns." "Quadruplets," Alexander said, still struggling to process it. "That's why you were so tired those last few months. The morning sickness that wouldn't stop." "High-risk pregnancy with quadruplets will do that to you," Elena said. "Not that you noticed. You were too busy planning your escape." Alexander flinched at her words. "I didn't know." "Would it have made a difference?" Elena asked, looking him directly in the eyes for the first time. Alexander wanted to say yes to claim he never would have left had he known. But the truth was, he didn't know. The man he had been 40 years ago might still have run. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I was selfish back then." Elena nodded, accepting his honesty if nothing else. "Well, we managed just fine without you." "How?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious. "Quadruplets, that must have been incredibly difficult." "It was," Elena admitted. "My parents helped at first. Then I built my business so I could work from home. It hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it." One of the boys, Andy, Alexander now recognized, ran up to the bench. "Mommy, Robbie says he can jump off the highest part." Elena was immediately on her feet. "Robbie, don't you dare." She rushed toward the playground. Alexander watched as she handled the situation with practiced ease, firm but loving. She'd become a remarkable mother while he'd been chasing empty thrills around the globe. When she returned to the bench, Alexander had made a decision. "I want to be part of their lives," he said. "I know I don't deserve it, and I know you have every reason to refuse, but they're my sons too." Elena studied him for a long moment. "You walked away once. How do I know you won't do it again when it gets hard?" "Because believe me, Alexander, parenting is the hardest thing you'll ever do. No business deal comes close." "I don't expect you to trust me," Alexander said, watching his sons play. "But I'm asking for a chance to earn it back." The boys were now playing a game of tag, their laughter carrying across the park. 4 little people who shared his blood but knew nothing of him. "I've missed 4 years," Alexander said quietly. "I don't want to miss any more." 3 days after the park confrontation, Alexander's realtor called with news. "We found a perfect property, Mr. Whitfield. It's just 2 miles from the address you specified." Within a week, Alexander had purchased a 5-bedroom colonial home in Elena's neighborhood. He'd never moved so quickly on a property before, but nothing about this situation was normal. His assistant arranged for designers to furnish it immediately, with 4 identical bedrooms created for the boys. "Too much?" Alexander asked his driver as they pulled up to the house, eyeing the giant playground equipment being installed in the backyard. "Not my place to say, sir," the driver replied diplomatically. Alexander knew he was overdoing it. But what else could he offer? He'd missed 4 birthdays, 4 Christmases, first words, first steps. Maybe things could make up for lost time. His phone rang. It was Elena. "The boys and I can visit Saturday morning," she said without greeting. "For 1 hour, and I'll be staying the entire time." Of course, Alexander agreed quickly. "That's perfect." "And Alexander, don't go overboard with gifts. They're not used to extravagance." He looked guiltily at the 4 identical bicycles being unloaded from a truck. "Right. Of course." When Saturday arrived, Alexander paced nervously around his new living room. He'd dismissed the staff, wanting the house to feel normal. Though nothing about 4 grand playrooms and a backyard that resembled a private amusement park was normal. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock. Alexander took a deep breath and opened the door. 4 identical faces stared up at him with unconcealed curiosity. Elena stood behind them, her expression carefully neutral. "Boys, this is Mr. Whitfield," she said, clearly avoiding the word father. "You're the man from the cafe," Robbie said immediately. "Why do you look like us?" Charlie asked, his eyes serious. Alexander knelt down, bringing himself to their eye level. "That's a good question. I look like you because, well, I'm your father. 4 pairs of eyes widened. The boys looked back at Elena for confirmation. Yes, Mr. Whitfield is your biological father, she said evenly. What's logical father mean? Tommy asked, fidgeting with his shoelace. Biological, Elena corrected gently. It means he helped make you. Andy, always direct, asked, Where have you been? Alexander swallowed hard. I've been traveling. For work. But I'm here now. Do you have toys? Tommy asked, practical concerns overtaking the big questions. Some, Alexander admitted. Would you like to see? The ice broken, the boys followed him inside, their initial hesitation giving way to childish excitement as they discovered the playroom. Look at all the trucks, Tommy gasped. There's a reading nook, Charlie exclaimed. Alexander had tried to cater to each boy's interests based on Elena's brief descriptions. Seeing their excitement, he felt a strange new sensation in his chest, something like pride, but warmer. Elena stood in the doorway, watching carefully. You went overboard, she said quietly when Alexander approached her. I know, I just wanted them to like being here, she sighed. Therefore, they'd be happy with cardboard boxes and crayons. They don't need all this stuff. Alexander watched as Robbie attempted to climb a bookshelf, Andy organized a pretend store with the toys, Tommy crashed toy cars together, and Charlie examined a globe with intense focus. They're amazing, he said softly. They're all so different. They've been different since day one, Elena replied, her voice softening slightly. Even in the NICU, they had their own personalities. Alexander turned to her. The NICU? Elena's expression closed again. They were born 6 weeks early. It's common with multiples. They spent their first month in the hospital. Another month he'd missed. Another time when Elena had been alone. Andy suddenly appeared at Alexander's side, tapping his pant leg. Will you read us a story? Mommy always does the voices. Alexander looked at Elena, seeking permission. She nodded slightly. I'd love to, he said, allowing himself to be led to the reading corner. He sat awkwardly on the floor as all 4 boys crowded around him. Charlie handed him a book about dinosaurs. This one, please. And you have to roar really loud for the T-Rex. Alexander cleared his throat and began to read, feeling 4 sets of eyes watching his every move. For the first time in his life, the billionaire tech mogul was terrified of failing at something that really mattered. Over the next 3 months, Alexander's calendar transformed from global business meetings to soccer practices and preschool pickups. His assistant nearly quit when he cancelled his annual tech summit in Tokyo, but Alexander didn't care. For the first time in his life, something mattered more than his empire. That didn't mean it was easy. No, Robbie, we don't climb on the kitchen counter, Alexander said one Saturday afternoon during his now regular weekend visits. He'd finally convinced Elena to let him watch the boys alone for a few hours. But I need the cookies up there, Robbie explained, as if this perfectly justified his dangerous climbing expedition. I'll get them for you, Alexander offered. I can do it myself, Robbie insisted, already halfway up the cabinet drawers. Alexander rushed forward just as Robbie lost his grip. He caught his son before he hit the floor, his heart pounding wildly. That's why we don't climb on counters, he said, his voice shaking slightly. Robbie looked up at him with Alexander's own eyes. You caught me. Of course I caught you. Mommy says you're learning, Robbie stated matter-of-factly. Alexander set him down carefully. Learning what? How to be a daddy, Robbie replied, his attention already back on the cookies. Later that evening, after all 4 boys had been picked up by Elena, Alexander called his real estate agent again. The mansion isn't working, he said bluntly. It's too big, too many places for them to get hurt. I need something more normal. Within 2 weeks, Alexander had sold the mansion and bought a modest 4-bedroom home on a quiet street with a fenced backyard. He hired a local interior designer rather than his usual international firm, requesting rooms that were kid-proof and comfortable. When the boys visited the new house for the first time, their reaction caught him by surprise. It looks like home, Andy exclaimed, running to the cozy living room with its soft couches and sturdy coffee table. Can we build a fort? Tommy asked, eyeing the furniture arrangement. Sure, Alexander replied, realizing he had no idea how to build a fort. Charlie tugged his hand. Will you live here all the time now? not just on weekends. The simple question hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. "I'm trying to arrange that," he said honestly. "My work is complicated." That night, Alexander sat in his new home office, staring at the family photos he'd asked Elena for, hospital pictures of the boys as newborns, their first birthday, preschool portraits. He'd missed so much. His phone buzzed with an urgent email from his CFO. Another acquisition opportunity. Another chance to expand the empire he'd once lived for. Alexander closed the email without reading it fully and instead opened a different document, one outlining the restructuring of his entire company, moving headquarters from Singapore to Boston, establishing a proper succession plan, creating a role he could fill while being present for his sons. The next morning, Alexander arrived at Elena's house before the boys' soccer practice. "You look tired," she observed, letting him in. "Been working all night," he admitted. "Not on what you think, though." He handed her the folder detailing his company restructuring. "I'm moving back to the States permanently, setting up headquarters in Boston." Elena flipped through the pages, her expression unreadable. "You're giving up CEO responsibilities." "Scaling back," he corrected. "I'll still be involved, just not 24/7." She handed the folder back. "Why?" "Because I missed Robbie scoring his first goal last week. Because Tommy asked me to help with his science project and I was on a call with Tokyo. Because Andy wanted to know if I'd be at his birthday next month and I couldn't promise him." Elena's expression softened slightly. "The boys won't care about your corporate structure." "No," Alexander agreed. "But they'll care if I'm at their soccer games. If I can tuck them in at night sometimes. If I'm more than just the man who visits on weekends." Before Elena could respond, the thundering of little feet filled the hallway as all four boys raced downstairs in mismatched soccer uniforms. "You're early," Charlie exclaimed, running to Alexander. "Thought I'd help get everyone ready," Alexander said, kneeling down to fix Tommy's backwards shirt. "Can you tie my shoes?" Andy asked, sticking his foot out. "And mine," added Robbie. Alexander looked up at Elena, silently asking if this was okay. She nodded slightly, the smallest hint of approval in her eyes. As Alexander knelt on the floor, surrounded by chattering boys with shin guards and cleats, he realized something profound. His billion-dollar deals had never made him feel as accomplished as properly tying 4 pairs of tiny shoelaces. Nearly a year had passed since that fateful day in the cafe. Autumn leaves crunched under Alexander's feet as he walked the boys home from school. He'd settled into a rhythm with them now, Monday pickup, Wednesday dinner, and weekend visits that often stretched from Friday afternoon until Sunday evening. And then Luke brought his turtle for show and tell, Andy was saying, his hands moving wildly as he told the story. "It was so slow," Tommy added, "but teacher said turtles can live 100 years. "Can we get a turtle?" Charlie asked, his quiet voice always the most thoughtful. "Or a dog?" Robbie countered, always aiming higher. Alexander laughed. "Let's talk to your mom about that." As they approached Elena's house, Alexander's phone buzzed. He glanced at it quickly, then back at the boys. A year ago, he would have taken the call regardless of the situation. Now, he silenced it without a second thought. Inside, the boys scattered to play while Alexander lingered in the kitchen with Elena. These moments had grown less awkward over the months, but Alexander still felt the weight of their past hanging between them. "They had a good day," he told her, leaning against the counter. "Charlie's teacher says he's reading at a second-grade level now." Elena smiled proudly. "He's always got his nose in a book, just like he used to." The casual reference to their shared past caught Alexander off guard. It was the first time Elena had acknowledged any good memory between them. Before he could respond, the phone rang. Elena answered, her expression quickly changing. "What? When?" She pressed the phone to her ear. "Yes, we'll be right there." Alexander straightened. "What's wrong?" "It's Robbie," Elena said, her voice tight with worry. "The school nurse just called. He collapsed during after-school care. They've taken him to Memorial Hospital." The next hours were a blur. The hospital waiting room. The other boys huddled together, unusually quiet. Doctors with serious faces. Tests, more tests, words like infection and compromised immune system. Through it all, Alexander stayed. Not because he had to prove something, but because he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. When the doctor finally allowed them into Robbie's room, Alexander felt his heart twist at the sight of his normally energetic son looking so small against the white hospital sheets. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, taking Robbie's hand. "You gave us quite a scare." "My head hurts," Robbie mumbled. "The medicine will help with that," Elena assured him, standing on the other side of the bed. The doctor had explained that Robbie had a serious infection that would require several days in the hospital. Elena organized childcare for the other boys, planning to stay with Robbie overnight. "I can stay too," Alexander offered. "There's room for both of us." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "You have that board meeting tomorrow. The merger you've been working on." Alexander shook his head. "It doesn't matter. Your company will still be there," he interrupted gently. "Robbie needs us both right now." For 3 days and nights, they took shifts by Robbie's bedside. When he wasn't with Robbie, Alexander took care of the other boys, maintaining their routines while Elena stayed at the hospital. The doctors finally announced that the antibiotics were working and Robbie could go home in another day. That evening, Alexander brought dinner to Elena in the hospital cafeteria. She looked exhausted but relieved. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything this week." Alexander shook his head. "You don't need to thank me for being a father." "Not just that," Elena clarified, "for being reliable." "I never thought I'd use that word to describe you again." They ate in companionable silence for a while. Then Elena asked, "Do you remember that cafe where we ran into each other?" "How could I forget?" Alexander smiled faintly. "It's our anniversary today," Elena said. 1 year since fate threw us back together." Alexander blinked in surprise. "I didn't realize." "Next week, when Robbie's better, would you maybe want to get coffee there? Just the two of us?" The question hung in the air between them, not quite forgiveness, but something like a beginning. "I'd like that very much," Alexander replied softly. Later, as they sat together beside Robbie's sleeping form, their hands accidentally touched on the edge of the hospital bed. Neither pulled away. It wasn't the grand reunion Alexander might have once imagined. There were no dramatic declarations or passionate embraces. Instead, there was something better. The quiet understanding of two people who had been broken apart, but were finding their way back, not to what they had been, but to something new. Something real. Something built on the foundation of 4 little boys who had their father's eyes and their mother's heart.